Okay, good evening, and welcome to the second session of the Jews for Judaism Counter-Missionary Survival Seminar. Tonight's topic is the real Messiah, part 1. Stay tuned for next week, part 2. So tonight's class is going to be a very critical class because we're going to discuss the central claim of Christianity. The word Messiah in Greek is Christos. And when people refer to Jesus as Jesus Christ, Christ is not his last name, like Jesus Goldberg or Jesus Cohen, but Christ means Jesus the Christ, Jesus the Messiah. That's the claim they're making. They're making the claim that Jesus was the Christ, meaning Jesus was the Messiah. Our question tonight is going to be, how do we evaluate that claim? How do we know whether or not someone was the Messiah, or whether someone is the Messiah? Obviously, to answer this question, we have to have a clear and accurate definition of what is the Messiah. Right? Without a clear definition, there's no way of evaluating whether or not someone is or isn't. Let me give you an example. This morning, I was listening to the radio, and they asked the question of their listeners, how many of them thought that the terrible bombing in Boston was an act of terror? How many people thought the terrible bombing in Boston was an act of terror? And it was reported that 82% of the people listening to this radio station thought that the bombing in Boston was an act of terror. I thought this was very strange. To me, it was 100% clear that the bombing in Boston was an act of terror. 100% clear. I was wondering, why did only 82% of the people think that it was an act of terror? What did they think it was? So it was clear to me that the problem here was, what is the definition of terror? Obviously, not all of the people answering this question had the exact same definition of what is terrorism. So our question tonight, the issue tonight is going to be, what is the definition of the Messiah? What is the meaning of the Messiah? Who is the Messiah? What is the Messiah? And once we have a very clear definition, if we have a clear template, then we can evaluate anyone, whether they are or they aren't. That's the job for tonight. That's our assignment for tonight. So let's begin with trying to understand at the beginning tonight simply the meaning of the word. The word Messiah in Hebrew is Mashiach. Mashiach. Mashiach basically means to anoint. To anoint in the Bible was the act of usually pouring oil on someone or something in order to dedicate that person or that thing into the service of God. So for example, when you go through, when you read through the Bible, you'll see that when the Jewish people built the Mishkan, the tabernacle, in the desert after they came out of Egypt, they anointed the vessels of the Mishkan. They anointed the menorah and the altar, etc. They took oil and they poured it over the parts of the Mishkan. we go through the Bible, we see that there were special people who were anointed, who had oil put on their head. For example, Aaron, the first high priest, right, was anointed with oil. So the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, was anointed, was someone who was anointed, and that person would be called an anointed one. The person would be called a Mashiach, a Mashiach, a Messiah. We see in the Bible that the kings, the Jewish kings, like Shaul, Saul, the first king, was anointed with oil. He had oil put on his head. So Shaul would be called a Mashiach, a Messiah. David, right? The second king is anointed with oil. And so he is called an anointed one, a Messiah, a Mashiach. There are times in the Bible where we see that prophets, a Navi, a prophet could be anointed with oil. So the important thing to understand is that in our Bible, in our Tanakh, in the Jewish Bible, there are many messiahs. That's an important thing to understand. There are many people who could be called a Messiah. There's not just one Messiah. There are many people. If you were living at the times of the Bible and you asked someone, where is the Messiah? They would say, which one? Are you referring to the high priest? Are you referring to the king? Are you referring to the prophet? The question tonight that we're going to try to analyze, though, is, does the Bible teach us anything about a special Messiah who would come in the future? And that Messiah we call the Messiah. The Messiah. In Hebrew, we would say Ha-Mashiach. Ha-Mashiach. Not just any Messiah, but the Messiah. So again, we start off tonight understanding that in the Bible there are many Messiahs, but where does the Bible speak about the Messiah? And the important thing to understand is the Bible never speaks about someone that the Bible calls the Messiah. Now that would have made the class tonight much shorter. It would have been a very easy class if you could go to the Bible, open up the index. The index of a Bible is called a concordancia, a concordance, and look up the word Ha-Mashiach, the Messiah, and let's say you would find 25 places where the Bible, the Torah, speaks about the Messiah, and you would know exactly what the Bible teaches us about the Messiah. The problem for us tonight is that word never appears in the Bible to describe someone who is going to come in the future. So how do we discover, how do we know that there is such a concept in the Bible? How do we know that the Bible has such a concept of a special anointed person who will come in the future that we call the Messiah? So let's try to understand how this concept developed. Number one, first part. The first thing to understand is that if you read through the entire Bible, you read through our entire Bible, you'll find there is one primary theme when the Bible speaks about the future. One primary theme. Now, there are times occasionally when a prophet speaks about the future when he's warning the Jewish people to improve. sometimes the prophet might say to the Jewish people, if you don't improve, God will punish you. That's a prediction. So, for example, when Jonah, the prophet, comes to Nineveh, so Jonah says that in 40 days, Nineveh will be overturned unless the people there improve. So there the prophet is making a prediction. And occasionally you will find in the Bible times when the prophet makes a prediction warning the people about what is going to happen if they don't improve. However, most of the predictions in the Bible, most of the we call prophecies in the Bible that speak about the future are describing a special world, a new kind of world that will exist. Meaning this, for most of human history, and for most of Jewish history, the world has been a broken place. The world has been a place of war. The world has been a place of suffering. The world has been a place of unhappiness. The Jewish people have suffered throughout our history. The world is not the way it is supposed to be. The prophets all spoke about a time in the future when the world will be improved. The prophets all described a world where the world is going to be what we call a utopia, a paradise. That's the major theme in the Bible when the prophets spoke about the future. Let's try to understand what picture they painted. What kind of picture do they paint? The first theme that we'll discuss, if you want to follow in these sheets, it starts on page 4. But the first theme that the prophets described was that the Jewish people would return to live in their homeland in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. Meaning for much of Jewish history, we have been in galut, we have been in exile. The prophets tell us that in the future, all the Jewish people will return to their homeland. All the Jewish people will return to live in the land of Israel. That includes, by the way, not just the Jewish people who are living in the world today, but we know that over 2,000 years ago, we had 10 of our tribes were taken into exile and basically disappeared. We call them the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And so the prophets here predict, they tell us, that in the future, all those people they were called the tribes of Israel, right? The ones that remained, we are from what's called the tribes of Judah, the kingdom of Judah. But the 10 northern tribes from the kingdom of Israel that went into exile, they will be reunited with us. So not only will all the Jewish people that we know, today, come back to live in the land of Israel, but we're told that the lost tribes, those 10 lost tribes from the kingdom of Israel, they will also reunite with us. That's an amazing prophecy, that the Jewish people will be reunited in our homeland. The second theme that I want to point out is on page 5. And this theme tells us that when the Jewish people return to our land, we will rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. We will have